The origins of the orcs in Middle-earth is a hotly contested issue, and whether or not they originate from elves who were corrupted by Melkor, or were actually a separate type of beast altogether, is center stage in a huge debate. Even Tolkien himself has gone back and forth on the issue, and this, along with the fates of mortal men on Middle-earth, is one of the big questions that he left unanswered before his death. But what do the actual published texts say on this issue? According to the canon, how exactly were orcs created? Now, to answer that, we have to take a trip back in time, well before the Third Age of Middle-earth and Frodo's mission with the Fellowship. In fact, we'll have to turn the clock back past the Second and First Age as well, to a time before the Sun and Moon actually. And yes, there was a time before the Sun and Moon in Middle-earth. We will look at the Years of the Trees, which is the second major period of Arda, which is Tolkien's name for our Earth. So, what did the world look like at this time? Well, there were no elves, men, or dwarves for much of this age. Men would be born with the rising of the first sun on the first day of the First Age, and dwarves, while created during the darkness of the Years of the Trees, would be put back to sleep for many years and wouldn't arise until at least about the 11,000th year of the period, which was only 14,000 years long anyway. Before the elves were born, who would come into existence shortly before the dwarves? So that means about 11,000 years into this age, the land of Middle-earth was completely under darkness. And that wasn't a mistake or an accident, that was actually by design. You see, Melkor, the first great Dark Lord, had fought with his brothers and sisters, fellow powerful gods known as the Valar. Neither side was able to win, but for his part, Melkor was pretty happy. The stalemate that resulted in their battle allowed him to keep his fortress underneath Middle-earth, and the other Valar decided to go to a new continent instead of trying to wrestle Middle-earth from Melkor's control. So, for much of this age, again, the Years of the Trees as it was known, the entire continent that would later hold Gondor, the Shire, and even Mordor was corrupted by Melkor. From his underground kingdom, he bred and experimented on all the creatures that inhabited the surface and the depths. Now, up to this point, there were no sentient creatures on Middle-earth except for the gods themselves, these Valar and Maiar gods. Elves, men, and dwarves, as I mentioned earlier, with all those different ages and numbers and years, were planned to come pretty soon, but Melkor wasn't able to get his hands on any just yet, so it was just beasts and animals and different types of non-sentient creatures that Melkor was able to manipulate and transform into monsters. And if you think about the primordial creatures that Melkor would have access to, then you can kind of see what the monsters he could make were. Of the Maiar, a lesser rank of gods similar to the Valar, he was able to collaborate and bring Balrogs to life. These were the great demons and heavy infantry of his army. They held the great fiery whips, and their leader Gothmog was famous for his giant black axe. During the Years of the Trees, we also know that Middle-earth was already populated by beasts and animals, like I mentioned earlier, because in the previous periods, the Years of the Lamps, creatures came into being right after the goddess Yavanna brought force into the world. This means there were likely wolves, bears, lions, and other terrifying carnivores roaming the land. Now, some of these might have been actually created by Melkor from the very beginning. That's entirely possible, especially with wolves, since we hear about them so often in conjunction with Melkor's dark creatures. But they were probably just indigenous species that roamed Middle-earth before Melkor even invaded it. But after returning to Middle-earth, the Dark Lord used these creatures to make his dark beasts for himself. Tolkien doesn't go into great description at this point, but we can imagine what Melkor might have made. In the Third Age, when the Fellowship encounters the Watcher outside of Durin's door in the Mines of Moria, the large tentacle monster isn't any species that Gandalf knows about. As one of the wisest Maiar gods, for him to not know about something as powerful as the Watcher is pretty important. It means it likely wasn't made by the Valar during the early days of Arda, and it's more likely that this creature is one of the thousands that Melkor created in his time in Autumno. It's possible that wargs and fell beasts were also devised at this time. The only thing that Tolkien does say about Morgoth's earliest monsters was that they were horned and vicious, and they killed so much and so often that they would dye the land red with blood of their prey. And later, when the first elves awoke into the world, they were unable to freely explore the world, basically because the woods and skies were filled with these shadows and monsters that would snatch them up. And the elves that were captured by those monsters that Melkor created were never seen again by their families. And it's here that we get back to our main question, actually. So, what does the canon say about the creation of the orcs? Well, we have to look at the elves, because after the first elves awoke into existence 10,000 years into the years of the trees, they were more or less stuck. They were born by the shores of a great lake, and if they ever trekked off alone to explore the world, dark riders on horses or flying beasts or giant monsters in the forest would capture them. Here's the exact quote from Tolkien about it. All those of the Quendi, which means elves, who came into the hands of Melkor, ere Tumno was broken, meaning before the Valar gods freed Middle-earth from Melkor, which they would later do, were put there in prison, and by slow arts and cruelty were corrupted and enslaved. And thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of orcs in envy and mockery of the elves. If elves were able to be twisted and corrupted into such terrible things, then you can imagine what Melkor would be able to do with a far less graceful creature. If Melkor got his hands on a whale or a shark or a gorilla from Far Harad, what type of terrible monster would he have made? I suppose it's not a question of would he have made, but rather, what did he make? There's so much that we don't know about the creatures Melkor made, but we've always told about the terrible monsters and dangers of Middle-earth. So we can almost say with certainty that Melkor created way more than we've ever seen. And it's also important to note the most critical flaw in Melkor's abilities. Like the other Valar gods, Melkor isn't able to create real life. He doesn't have the ability to imbue creatures with souls. So the best he can do is take a living creature and use his evil power over nature to change its form into something terrifying. Now, we know that Tolkien clearly states that orcs come from early elves in the Silmarillion, but he later went on to refute this actually, or at least question it. Remember, everything that Tolkien wrote wasn't actually his, so to speak. He imagined himself as a simple historian, collecting the early stories of Earth and assembling them into books. So for the Silmarillion, he thought of it as a history text, originally written in Elvish, although later translated by men, implicated to even be Bilbo at one point, and then, later translated by himself into modern English. Since he wasn't actually writing the Silmarillion as the creator of the entire mythology in his own mind, and instead as someone merely translating something written by ancient elves, he could say, well, this might not be true because the elves didn't have a clear understanding of the universe, or he could also say, well, these were biased opinions because of X, Y, or Z, or even, yeah, those elf guys had no idea what they were talking about because Eru Ilúvatar, the creator of the universe, would have never allowed it. And that's exactly what Tolkien would consider in later years in his private letters when he was talking to his friends about how could orcs come from something as pure as the elves, and if the orcs were descendant from elves, did they have immortal souls? And even until the day he died, Tolkien was never really happy with any possible origin story for the orcs. I personally don't really know how I feel about the issue. On one hand, I really like the idea that the orcs are derived from elves because then there's this kind of, perfect balance with having a light side species, so to speak, and a dark side species in the world of Middle-earth, but it does raise a lot of questions when you start to think about how important the soul and the spirits of these different creatures were. Let me know what you guys think. Leave me a comment, and we'll discuss it more down below. Catch you guys next time.